London, 1540. Darkness falls on a timber house near Cheapside. A woman prepares for the night, and no sanctuary awaits her. 30 separate ordeals are waiting for her before dawn, and every one of them has been documented in the parish registers, the coroner's rolls, and the household accounts that scholars are still reading today. Vermin crowd the straw mattress, violence waits behind the bolted door, and fear settles into the bedchamber like smoke. The candle gutters, and the dark closes in completely. But to understand how it came to this, we need to go back to the beginning. Tudor England's nocturnal ordeal would later become the exact thing that defined every woman's existence from dusk to dawn. But in 1485, it was just the ordinary condition of life after dark. The Tudor period, stretching from Henry VII's coronation in 1485 through to Elizabeth I's death in 1603, is remembered as an age of splendor, of great houses and gilded courts, of explorers setting sail from the Thames. That image belongs almost entirely to the daylight hours. Once the sun descended below the rooftops of London, Norwich, Bristol, or York, a different England emerged, shaped by darkness, physical danger, legal vulnerability, and 30 documented ordeals that repeated themselves every single night. Sunset did not merely end the working day, it ended safety. The curfew bell, rung at St. Mary le Bow and echoed by parish churches across the city, signaled the hour at which respectable citizens were expected indoors. For men, this represented inconvenience. For women, it represented the beginning of a nightly ordeal the daylight world preferred not to examine. Social rank shaped the specific texture of that ordeal, but never eliminated it. A merchant's wife in Cheapside faced different dangers than a laborer's wife in Southwark, but both faced the infested bed, the smoking hearth, the chamber pot, and the locked door. Even Anne Boleyn, Queen of England from 1533 until her execution in 1536, and Catherine Parr, who survived Henry VIII and died in 1548, inhabited palace bedchambers that documented persistent vermin, inadequate sanitation, and the theological terror of the dark hours. The record of those 30 ordeals, accumulated across parish registers, household accounts, medical treatises, and legal depositions, constitutes one of the most comprehensive and least examined archives of female experience in English history. The historian A. L. Rouse observed that Tudor domestic life has been systematically romanticized by later generations. The primary sources do not romanticize, they record. Tudor women celebrated the end of each day's labor and settled into what they believed was the shelter of their own homes. They shouldn't have. The first ordeal, and in many respects the foundational one from which all others radiated, was the bed itself. The Tudor bed was not a place of rest, it was a battlefield, and the enemies it harbored were small, numerous, and entirely indifferent to social rank. The Tudor bed, in the year 1540, is one of the most documented objects in English domestic history, and almost none of what the documents record is comfortable. To understand the infestation that awaited every woman who lay down to sleep in 16th century England, it is necessary first to understand the physical construction of the beds themselves. For the majority of the population, the sleeping surface consisted of a linen or canvas sack stuffed with straw, rushes, or occasionally wool. These were called mattresses, though the word carried none of its modern connotations of hygiene or comfort. The straw inside was rarely replaced more than once annually, and in poorer households, the interval between replacements could stretch to 2 or 3 years. During that interval, the mattress became a self-contained ecosystem. Human warmth, human sweat, human skin cells shed during sleep, and the moisture of breath condensing in the cold air of an unheated chamber combined to produce conditions that were, from the perspective of Simex lectularius, the common bedbug, and Pulex irritans, the human flea, and Pediculus humanus, the body louse, essentially ideal. The bedbug, in particular, was a fixture of Tudor domestic life so universal that it appears in household inventories, medical treatises, and popular verse without any apparent sense that its presence required explanation or apology. The insect hides during daylight hours, in the seams of mattresses, in the joints of wooden bed frames, in the cracks of plaster walls, and behind wall hangings, emerging after dark to feed on sleeping human bodies. Its bite produces a raised, intensely itchy welt, and a single female bedbug, once established, can lay between 200 and 500 eggs over the course of her lifetime, each egg hatching within a week under warm conditions. A bed frame that had harbored bedbugs for a single season contained, by the most conservative estimate, hundreds of individual insects at various stages of development, and the wooden construction of Tudor bed frames, with their mortise and tenon joints and their carved decorative surfaces, provided exactly the kind of irregular, sheltered surface in which the insects could establish themselves beyond any practical means of eradication. The flea presented a different but equally persistent problem. Pulex irritans, the human flea, was the most commonly documented parasite in Tudor household accounts, in part because its bites were more immediately dramatic than those of the bedbug. The flea's saliva contains compounds that provoke an intense immune response in most human hosts, producing a sharp, burning sensation at the site of the bite and a spreading area of redness and swelling that could persist for days. In a woman already weakened by poor nutrition, by the physical demands of repeated pregnancy, or by the respiratory illnesses that the smoky Tudor interior encouraged, flea bites did not merely itch, they became infected. The scratching that was the inevitable response to a night spent on an infested mattress broke the skin. And broken skin in the Tudor bedchamber, where the air was thick with the products of combustion, where hands were rarely washed, and where no concept of bacterial infection yet existed to motivate preventive hygiene, was an invitation to secondary infection that could, and frequently did, become serious. The body louse, Pediculus humanus, completed what might be called the triumvirate of Tudor nocturnal parasites. Unlike the bedbug, which lived in the bed itself, and unlike the flea, which could travel freely between host and environment, the body louse lived in clothing, in the seams of linen shifts and woolen gowns, moving to the skin only to feed. Since Tudor women slept in their shifts, the louse's feeding took place primarily at night, concentrated in the warm, compressed areas where clothing pressed against skin: the armpits, the waistband, the collar, the inner thighs. The louse's bite was less dramatic than the flea's, but more persistent, and the scratching it provoked was continuous rather than episodic. Women who had lived with body lice for any length of time, which is to say virtually all women in Tudor England, developed a habitual, semi-conscious scratching behavior that contemporaries noted without apparent concern, since it was simply the expected condition of a person who slept in a bed. The documentary record of these infestations is extensive. The household accounts of Hampton Court Palace, the great residence built by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey and surrendered to Henry VIII in 1529, include repeated references to the purchase of materials intended to address vermin in the royal sleeping quarters. Fumigation with sulfur, the burning of herbs including pennyroyal and tansy, the application of mercury-based compounds to bed frames, and the periodic dismantling and cleaning of bedsteads are all recorded in the accounts of the royal household, and they are recorded with a frequency that makes clear these were not occasional emergency measures, but routine maintenance activities that nonetheless failed to produce lasting results. If the royal household of Henry VIII, with its armies of servants, its access to the most expensive remedies available, and its capacity to replace furnishings at will, could not keep its bedchambers free of vermin, the condition of ordinary domestic bedchambers throughout England requires little imagination to reconstruct. The physician Andrew Boord published his Dietary of Health in 1542 and addressed sleeping conditions with the plain, direct tone that Tudor medical writing typically brought to subjects that later centuries found delicate. board recommended that the bedchamber be kept free of cats and dogs, that the windows be opened during the day to allow air to circulate, and that the bed linen be changed frequently. The advice was entirely sensible and entirely beyond the practical capacity of most Tudor households to follow. Linen was expensive. Washing it required large quantities of water, which had to be carried from a well or river, heated over a fire, and then used to scrub the fabric by hand before being wrung out and hung to dry. A process that in the damp English climate could take several days. Most Tudor households possessed 2 sets of bed linen at most, and the interval between washings was measured in weeks rather than days. The consequences of sleeping on infested bedding night after night were not merely the discomfort of bites and the disruption of sleep, though both were significant and well documented. The physical consequences extended to the skin itself. Women who spent years sleeping on infested mattresses developed chronic skin conditions that the Tudor medical tradition attributed to a variety of causes, including imbalances in the 4 humors, exposure to cold night air, and the influence of malign celestial bodies, but that modern dermatological understanding would recognize as the predictable result of repeated insect bites combined with secondary bacterial infection. The scratching that was the immediate response to a bite broke the epidermis, and in the absence of any effective antiseptic treatment, these small wounds became infected with the staphylococcal and streptococcal bacteria that were endemic in the Tudor domestic environment. The result was a chronic cycle of bite, scratch, infection, and partial healing that left the skin of many Tudor women in a state of persistent inflammation. The royal physician Thomas Vicary, who served Henry VIII and published his Anatomy of the Body of Man in 1548, described skin conditions consistent with chronic insect infestation among his patients, though he attributed them to internal imbalances rather than external parasites. The distinction mattered enormously in terms of treatment. If the condition arose from an excess of bile or a corruption of the blood, the appropriate remedy was dietary adjustment, purging, or bloodletting. If it arose from insect bites, the appropriate remedy was the elimination of the insects from the sleeping environment. Tudor medicine consistently chose the former explanation, which meant that the actual cause of the suffering was never addressed, and the suffering continued. The bed frame itself contributed to the problem in ways that went beyond its role as a harbor for parasites. Tudor bed frames were constructed from oak, elm, or ash, and they were substantial pieces of furniture, particularly in wealthier households, where the great bed, with its carved posts, its tester canopy, and its curtains of wool or silk, represented a significant portion of the household's total wealth. The Great Bed of Ware, now held by the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, measures approximately 10 feet square and could accommodate, according to contemporary accounts, 8 or more sleepers. This communal sleeping arrangement, which was entirely normal across all but the wealthiest strata of Tudor society, meant that the parasites present on one sleeper's body or clothing were rapidly distributed among all occupants of the bed. A woman who might have kept herself relatively free of lice through careful attention to her clothing found herself reinfested nightly by sharing a bed with a husband, children, or servants who had not taken the same precautions. The communal nature of Tudor sleeping arrangements deserves particular emphasis because it is so completely at odds with the modern assumption of the private bed as a personal sanctuary. In Tudor England, the bed was a shared space. In great households, the master and mistress shared their chamber with personal servants who slept on trundle beds or pallets at the foot of the great bed. In ordinary households, multiple family members shared a single bed, with children sleeping between or beside their parents. In the poorest households, an entire family might share a single mattress on the floor, with lodgers or servants sleeping nearby. Each additional body in the sleeping space represented an additional vector for the introduction and spread of parasites, and the warm, compressed conditions of multiple bodies sharing a confined space were, again, precisely the conditions that parasites required to thrive. The historian Keith Thomas, in his foundational study Religion and the Decline of Magic, published in 1971, noted that the Tudor understanding of the natural world did not include any concept of the parasite as a biological entity with its own reproductive cycle and environmental requirements. Insects were understood as spontaneously generated from filth, from corrupted matter, from the miasmatic air of enclosed spaces. This understanding, derived from Aristotle and transmitted through medieval natural philosophy, meant that the Tudor response to infestation was always reactive rather than preventative. One addressed the insects that were already present, rather than attempting to prevent their arrival, because their arrival was understood as a natural consequence of organic matter existing in the world, not as the result of a reproductive process that could be interrupted. The remedies that Tudor women employed against the parasites in their beds were numerous, documented in household recipe books, in herbals, and in the margins of medical texts, and they were, by any modern assessment, largely ineffective. Pennyroyal, the small-leaved mint Mentha pulegium, was the most commonly recommended herb for repelling fleas, and it does possess some insect-repellent properties, though not sufficient to clear an established infestation. Wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, was similarly recommended and similarly insufficient. Fleabane, Pulicaria dysenterica, whose very name records its intended purpose, was strewn on floors and tucked into mattress seams with the same optimistic futility. More aggressive remedies included the application of mercury compounds to bed frames, a practice documented in several household accounts, and one that, while it may have killed some insects on contact, did nothing to address the eggs and nymphs sheltering in the deeper crevices of the woodwork, and that exposed the women applying it to the well-documented toxic effects of mercury itself. The royal household employed specialist staff, whose duties included the periodic dismantling of royal bedsteads for cleaning, a labor-intensive process that involved removing all the hangings and curtains, scrubbing the wooden frame with lye or vinegar, and fumigating the entire chamber with burning sulfur or herbs. This process is documented in the accounts of the Office of the Wardrobe and the Office of the Chamber for multiple reigns, and its frequency, typically 2 to 4 times per year, suggests that even with this level of attention, the royal bedchambers were not free of vermin for any sustained period. For ordinary households, where no such specialist staff existed, and where the resources for periodic fumigation were not available, the infestation was simply a permanent condition of the sleeping environment. The physical ordeal of sleeping on an infested mattress, of lying still while dozens of insects fed on one's body, of waking repeatedly to scratch, of finding in the morning that the skin of one's arms and legs and neck was covered in the raised red welts that marked each feeding site, was an ordeal that Tudor women endured every single night of their lives, from childhood to death. It was continuous and universal, and the Tudor world had normalized it so completely that the primary sources record it not with horror, but with the plain tone of people describing the weather, a condition of existence no more extraordinary than the cold of winter or the heat of summer. The scratching, the bleeding skin, the chronic infections, the disrupted sleep, were the first ordeal of the Tudor night, and they were waiting in the bed before any woman lay down to rest. What followed, as the night deepened and the chamber pot's presence became impossible to ignore, was a different kind of ordeal entirely, one that engaged not the skin but the nose, and one that implicated not merely personal comfort, but the entire structure of household responsibility that Tudor society placed upon women's shoulders. The Tudor bedchamber, in the decades between 1485 and 1603, contained, alongside the infested mattress and the smoking tallow candle, a ceramic or pewter vessel of between 1 and 3 gallons capacity that represented one of the most intimate and least examined aspects of nocturnal female experience in early modern England. The chamber pot was not a discrete accessory. It was a central feature of the Tudor night, its presence announced by smell long before it was encountered by sight, and its management fell, in virtually every documented household, to women. The question of what happened to human waste during the hours of darkness, when the streets were locked behind curfew and the communal jakes, the shared outdoor privy, was inaccessible or dangerous to reach, is one that Tudor domestic records address with a frankness that later centuries found embarrassing and therefore tended to excise from the popular histories that shaped public understanding of the period. The chamber pot's contents, accumulated over the course of a night in which a household might include a husband and wife, several children, and 1 or more servants, represented a substantial volume of liquid and solid waste that had to be stored until morning in a vessel that was, by definition, unlidded and unventilated. The stench that this produced in the enclosed space of a Tudor bedchamber, where windows were typically kept shut against the night air, which was universally believed to carry disease, was not a minor inconvenience. It was a pervasive, penetrating odor that permeated the bedding, the wall hangings, the clothing stored in the chamber, and the hair and skin of the people sleeping there. Contemporary sources that address the subject at all tend to do so in terms that suggest the smell was simply accepted as a feature of the night, much as the cold or the darkness was accepted, a condition of existence rather than a problem to be solved. The communal jakes, the outdoor privy shared by an entire household and sometimes by multiple households in densely packed urban areas, was the daytime alternative to the chamber pot. But it was an alternative that became largely inaccessible after curfew. The jakes was typically located in the yard behind the house, sometimes at a distance from the main building, and reaching it after dark required navigating an unlit exterior space in which the risks of accident, assault, and the simple terror of darkness combined to make the journey genuinely hazardous. The chamber pot was therefore not merely a convenience, but a necessity, and its presence in the bedchamber throughout the night was not a choice, but a structural feature of Tudor domestic life. The management of the chamber pot was, in Tudor households, explicitly a female responsibility. The household manuals of the period, including Thomas Tusser's 500 Points of Good Husbandry, first published in 1557 and revised through multiple editions until 1580, allocated the duties of household waste management to the wife and her female servants, without apparent awareness that this allocation required any justification. Tusser's verse instructions for the Tudor housewife include references to the proper management of the yard, the cesspit, and the household's waste products, all framed as part of the wife's natural domain of domestic governance. The emptying of chamber pots, the cleaning of the vessels, and the disposal of their contents in the cesspit or the street were tasks that fell to women by default and by custom, tasks that were performed daily, that were physically unpleasant, and that carried real health risks in a world that did not understand the mechanisms of disease transmission, but that nonetheless suffered their consequences. The cesspit, or privy vault, that served most Tudor urban households was a pit dug in the yard, lined with brick or stone, and covered with a wooden seat. These pits required periodic emptying by the night soil men, specialist workers who came before dawn to remove the accumulated waste by hand and cart it away from the city. The records of the London Corporation document the activities of night soil collectors throughout the Tudor period, and they make clear that the interval between emptyings was rarely less than several months and frequently longer. In the interim, the cesspit filled, overflowed in wet weather, and leached its contents into the surrounding soil and, inevitably, into the shallow wells that provided drinking water for the same households. The connection between contaminated water and the epidemic diseases that killed Tudor Londoners in enormous numbers, particularly the sweating sickness that struck in 1485, 1508, 1517, 1528, and 1551, and the repeated outbreaks of plague that devastated the city throughout the 16th century, was not understood in terms of bacterial contamination, but the correlation between proximity to cesspits and elevated mortality was observed and recorded by contemporaries, who attributed it to miasma, to the corrupting influence of foul air, rather than to waterborne pathogens. The streets of Tudor London served, in addition to their function as thoroughfares, as an extension of the household waste disposal system. The practice of emptying chamber pots from upper windows into the street below, accompanied by the traditional warning cry of "Gardez-l'eau," a corruption of the French "Gardez-l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water," was so common that it was addressed by municipal ordinances throughout the Tudor period without any apparent success in curtailing it. The London Corporation issued repeated orders prohibiting the disposal of waste in the streets, specifying fines for householders who allowed their servants to empty chamber pots from windows, and designating specific locations where waste could legally be deposited. These ordinances were regularly ignored, as the continued reissuance of essentially identical regulations throughout the 16th century makes clear. The streets of London, particularly in the densely packed parishes of the city proper, where houses were built close together and yards were small or non-existent, were repositories of human waste that accumulated between the periodic rainfalls that washed it into the Thames. For women, the responsibility for managing this waste began before dawn and ended after dark. The chamber pot had to be emptied each morning, its contents carried through the house and deposited in the cesspit or the street, the vessel rinsed and returned to the bedchamber for the following night. This was not a task that could be delegated to a husband or a male servant in most households, not because men were physically incapable of performing it, but because the allocation of domestic labor in Tudor England was structured around a clear gender division in which the interior of the house and its maintenance were exclusively female territory. The household manuals, the conduct books, and the legal documents that define the Tudor wife's role all located her authority and her responsibility within the domestic space. And that domestic space included its least pleasant features as fully as its most pleasant ones. The health consequences of this arrangement were not trivial. Women who handled chamber pot contents without any protective equipment, which is to say all Tudor women, were regularly exposed to the pathogens present in human waste. Typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi and transmitted via the fecal-oral route, was endemic in Tudor England, and the women responsible for managing household waste were among those most consistently exposed to its source. Dysentery, caused by Shigella bacteria and similarly transmitted, was a recurring feature of Tudor domestic life, documented in household accounts and medical records throughout the period. The physician Thomas Fair, who published The Book of Children in 1544, the first English-language pediatric text, described the symptoms of what would now be recognized as dysenteric illness, in terms that make clear it was a familiar feature of Tudor childhood, and the mothers who nursed sick children while managing the household's waste were caught in a cycle of exposure and reinfection that the medical understanding of the time provided no means of interrupting. The stench that permeated the Tudor bedchamber throughout the night hours was not merely a sensory unpleasantness. It was, in the framework of Tudor medical theory, a genuine health threat. The miasmatic theory of disease, which held that illness was caused by the inhalation of corrupted air arising from decaying organic matter, was the dominant explanatory framework for epidemic disease throughout the Tudor period and well beyond it. Under this theory, the smell of the chamber pot was not merely offensive, but actively dangerous, a source of the corrupted air that caused the fevers, the fluxes, and the epidemic diseases that killed Tudor people in large numbers. The irony of this belief was that it was simultaneously wrong in its mechanism and correct in its practical implication. The air of the Tudor bedchamber, laden with the products of anaerobic bacterial decomposition in the chamber pot, was indeed associated with elevated disease risk, though not through the mechanism that Tudor physicians believed. The bacteria present in the air above a chamber pot that had been accumulating contents for several hours were real, even if the Tudor concept of miasma was not an accurate description of how they caused disease. Women's responses to the stench of the chamber pot were documented in household recipe books and in the margins of medical texts as a series of practical measures that were, like the measures against insect infestation, largely inadequate to the scale of the problem they addressed. Herbs were strewn on the floor of the bedchamber. Rosemary, lavender, meadowsweet, and sweet flag were all recommended in household manuals as floor coverings that would release their scent when trodden upon, and thereby counteract the ambient odor of the chamber. Pomanders, small perforated spheres containing aromatic substances, including dried orange peel, cloves, and ambergris, were hung in the bedchamber or carried on the person. Vinegar-soaked sponges were placed near windows. None of these measures addressed the source of the smell, and none of them were effective in eliminating it. They were, at best, palliative measures that slightly modified the olfactory experience of a space that remained genuinely unhealthy. The night soil collectors who came before dawn to empty cesspits were a documented feature of Tudor urban life, and their activities are recorded in the accounts of the London Corporation and in the records of individual parishes. These men, who worked by torchlight in the hours before the city woke, were among the lowest paid and least regarded workers in Tudor society, their occupation considered so degrading that it attracted social stigma even among the laboring poor. The records of St. Botolph Aldgate, one of the parishes that bordered the City of London to the east, include payments to night soil collectors throughout the Tudor period, and the intervals between recorded payments suggest that the service was provided irregularly, with gaps of several months between collections that allowed cesspits to fill and overflow. During these intervals, the management of household waste fell entirely to the women of the household, who had no alternative but to continue emptying chamber pots into a cesspit that was already at capacity, or into the street. The broader picture that emerges from these records is one of women managing, night after night, a domestic waste system that was structurally inadequate to the demands placed upon it, using tools and methods that were insufficient to the task, in conditions that were both physically unpleasant and genuinely hazardous to health. The chamber pot and the communal jakes were not peripheral features of the Tudor night. They were central to it, and the labor of managing them was women's labor, performed in the dark, before dawn, without acknowledgement and without relief. The records of the London Corporation's sanitation ordinances, stretching from the reign of Henry VII through to the final years of Elizabeth I, show that the corporation returned to the question of street waste and cesspit management no fewer than 14 times between 1485 and 1603. Each new ordinance acknowledging implicitly that the previous one had failed. The ward presentments of the City of London, in which local juries reported nuisances to the civic authorities, are filled with complaints about overflowing cesspits, blocked drainage channels, and the deposit of waste in streets and lanes. The ward of Farringdon Without, one of the most densely populated areas of the city, generated more than 30 such presentments between 1540 and 1580 alone, each one a piece of evidence that the women managing the household waste of that ward were doing so in conditions of chronic, systemic failure. The infrastructure was not designed to cope, and the women who operated within it bore the consequences in their health, their daily labor, and their nightly exposure to the pathogens that the system could not contain. Where the chamber pot stench settled into the fabric of the bedchamber and the night deepened toward its coldest hours, a second and more immediately life-threatening danger made its presence felt in the glow of the hearth that no Tudor household could safely extinguish before morning. The open hearth, in the Tudor domestic interior of the 16th century, was simultaneously the household's most essential feature and its most dangerous one. Fire provided warmth in the cold English climate, cooked the food, heated the water for washing, and supplied the light by which evening tasks were accomplished. Without fire, a Tudor household could not function. But fire in a structure built almost entirely from combustible materials, managed through the night by women who were already exhausted from the accumulated demands of the day, and left smoldering in hearths that were open to the room rather than enclosed behind iron doors, was a source of danger that the documentary record of Tudor England captures with grim regularity. The construction of the typical Tudor domestic building made it particularly vulnerable to fire. Timber-framed construction, in which a skeleton of oak beams was filled with panels of wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks plastered with clay, dung, and straw, was the standard building method for domestic structures throughout England during the 16th century. The roof was typically thatched with straw or reed, materials that, once ignited, burned with a speed and intensity that left little time for the occupants to escape. Even in urban areas, where brick construction was more common for the ground floors of larger buildings, the upper stories were frequently timber-framed, and the proximity of buildings to one another in the densely packed streets of Tudor London meant that a fire beginning in one structure could spread to its neighbors within minutes. The London fire records of the Tudor period document hundreds of nocturnal blazes, and the pattern they reveal is consistent. Fires that began in domestic hearths during the night hours, when the household was asleep and the fire was unattended, spread rapidly through the timber frame structure and frequently communicated to adjacent buildings before any alarm could be raised. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is the most famous of these events, but it was preceded by numerous smaller conflagrations throughout the Tudor period that destroyed entire streets and killed dozens of people. The records of the London Corporation document major fires in 1527, 1548, and 1569, among others, each of which destroyed multiple properties and left their occupants homeless. The women of the Tudor household bore a specific and documented relationship to the fire risk of the night. In the domestic division of labor that Tudor household manuals prescribed, the management of the hearth was a female responsibility. Thomas Tusser's 500 Points of Good Husbandry allocated to the housewife the tasks of banking the fire at night, ensuring that the embers were covered with ash to prevent them from throwing sparks, and rising during the night to tend the fire if it threatened to go out, or, conversely, if it showed signs of burning too freely. This last responsibility was particularly significant because a fire that burned too freely in an unattended hearth could throw sparks onto the rushes that covered the floor, onto the wall hangings, or onto the clothing that was stored near the hearth for warmth. And a spark that caught in these materials could become a blaze within minutes. The positioning of women nearest the hearth during sleep was not merely a matter of custom. It was a practical consequence of their responsibility for fire management. In the typical Tudor domestic arrangement, the wife and her female servants slept in the part of the chamber closest to the hearth, both to benefit from its warmth and to be immediately available to respond if the fire required attention during the night. This positioning, while it offered the benefit of warmth in the cold English climate, also placed women in the most dangerous location in the event of a fire that escaped control. The records of Tudor coroners' inquests, which survive in significant numbers for London and several other counties, document cases in which women were killed or seriously injured by fires that began in hearths while they slept nearby, the proximity that was supposed to make them safer, having instead placed them in the path of the flames. The absence of any organized firefighting capacity meant that once a fire had taken hold in a Tudor building, the only recourse was to attempt to remove the building's contents and to pull down adjacent structures to create a firebreak. The leather fire buckets that were required by municipal ordinance to be kept in every parish church and the hand-operated water squirts that represented the most sophisticated firefighting technology available in Tudor England were wholly inadequate to address a fire in a timber-framed building with the thatched roof. The parish constables who were responsible for raising the alarm when fire was discovered in the night had no means of extinguishing a blaze that had progressed beyond its earliest stages, and the hook and chain equipment used to demolish buildings in the path of a fire required a level of organization and physical strength that was rarely available in the confused, dark, and terrifying conditions of a nocturnal urban fire. The first organized fire brigade in England was not established until after the Great Fire of London in 1666, when the insurance companies that had emerged in the preceding decades began to maintain their own firefighting teams to protect properties they had insured. Throughout the Tudor period, the response to fire was entirely communal and entirely improvised, relying on the willingness of neighbors to assist and on the availability of water from wells, rivers, and water carriers. In the night hours, when neighbors were asleep and water carriers were not working, the communal response was slower and less effective than it was during the day, and fires that began after dark had more time to establish themselves before any organized response could be mounted. The psychological dimension of the fire risk was as significant as the physical one. Tudor women who were responsible for the management of the household hearth carried, as a consequence of that responsibility, a continuous awareness of the fire's potential for destruction that shaped their experience of the night in ways that the documentary record captures obliquely. The household manual's insistence on the proper banking of the fire at night, the repeated municipal ordinances requiring the covering of fires before the curfew bell, and the frequency with which fire appears in the personal correspondence and devotional writing of Tudor women as a metaphor for sudden, uncontrollable destruction, all suggest that the fire risk was not merely a background condition of Tudor life, but an active presence in the consciousness of the women who managed it. The coroner's records of Middlesex and Surrey, which survive in reasonable completeness for the latter part of the Tudor period, include numerous cases in which women died in nocturnal fires, and the language of these records, dry and formulaic as it is, conveys something of the speed and violence with which fire could transform a sleeping household into a catastrophe. A typical entry records that a woman, identified by name and parish, was found dead in the ruins of her house, following a fire that began, in the coroner's assessment, in the hearth of the principal chamber during the night hours. The cause of death is recorded as burning or suffocation, and the record moves immediately to the next case without further comment. The accumulation of these entries across the surviving coroner's rolls for the Tudor period creates a picture of nocturnal fire as a routine feature of domestic life. A risk that was accepted as part of the condition of living in a timber-framed building with an open hearth, much as the risk of drowning was accepted as part of the condition of living near a river. The herbs and preparations that Tudor women used to manage the fire risk were practical rather than medicinal. The proper covering of embers with ash, the use of a clay-lined curfew cover, a domed metal or ceramic vessel placed over the banked fire to contain any sparks, and the maintenance of a clear space around the hearth, free of rushes and other combustible materials, were all documented practices that reduced, though they could not eliminate, the risk of a nocturnal fire. The curfew cover, whose name gives the English language the word curfew, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, was a standard piece of household equipment in Tudor England, and its proper use was one of the responsibilities that the household manuals allocated to the wife as part of her nightly routine. The smoke produced by the Tudor hearth was itself a health hazard that the fire risk sometimes overshadows in historical accounts. The open hearth, which in many Tudor buildings lacked a proper chimney and relied instead on a hole in the roof or a louver to allow smoke to escape, produced levels of indoor air pollution that would be considered extreme by any modern standard. The burning of wood, peat, or coal in an open hearth released carbon monoxide, particulate matter, and a range of organic compounds into the air of the chamber, and the women who slept nearest the hearth were most consistently exposed to these products of combustion. The respiratory diseases that were endemic in Tudor England, including the chronic coughs and breathing difficulties that appear regularly in medical records and personal correspondence, were in significant part a consequence of this indoor air pollution, though Tudor medicine attributed them to cold air, to humoral imbalance, or to the will of God, rather than to the products of the fire that burned in every room. The Survey of London Parish Records, conducted by the antiquary John Stow, whose monumental Survey of London was published in 1598, contains numerous references to properties destroyed by fire in the preceding decades, and Stow's account of the parish of St. Giles without Cripplegate alone identifies 7 properties that had been wholly or substantially destroyed by fire between 1550 and 1590. Stow does not record the time of day at which these fires began, but the pattern established by the coroner's records and the London Corporation's fire accounts strongly suggests that the majority occurred during the night hours, when the household was asleep and the fire was unattended. The women who had been responsible for banking those fires, and who had perhaps done so imperfectly on the night in question, were, in many cases, among the dead. The fire risk in Tudor domestic life was real. It was routine, and it was managed by women, at night, without adequate tools, without any organized external assistance, and without any means of escape that did not depend on waking in time to recognize the danger. The women who banked the fire each night, who covered the embers with ash and clay, who slept nearest the hearth to tend it through the cold hours, and who woke to the smell of smoke in the dark of the night, were performing a task that was essential to the survival of the household, and that exposed them, in the performance of it, to the risk of their own destruction. And that wasn't even the part that got people angry. The fire that smoldered in the Tudor hearth through the night was a danger that women managed alone, in the dark, within the walls of a house that the law had placed entirely under the authority of the man who slept beside them. Up to this point, Tudor women had been managing the infested bed, the stinking chamber pot, and the fire risk as separate, discrete ordeals. That was about to flip, because the danger that came not from the hearth but from the bed itself added a dimension of threat that the law was not merely unprepared to address, but had actively constructed to ignore. Tudor women who endured violent marriages would look back on the night the law's silence became undeniable and wish they had understood its full implications sooner. The legal condition of the Tudor wife, in the England of the 16th century, was defined by a doctrine so comprehensive in its erasure of female legal identity that it required only a single Latin term to describe it: coverture. Under coverture, a woman who married ceased to exist as a legal person. Her property passed to her husband. Her contracts became his. Her debts became his. Her legal capacity to sue, to be sued, to make a will, or to enter into any binding agreement was extinguished at the moment of marriage and did not revive until her husband's death. The doctrine was not a marginal feature of Tudor law. It was its central organizing principle with respect to women, and it was articulated with clarity and without apology in the legal texts of the period. The jurist William Staunford, writing in his Les Plaies del Couronne in 1557, described the married woman's legal position in terms that would not have surprised any of his contemporaries. She was, in law, one person with her husband, and that person was him. The practical consequence of coverture for the Tudor woman's experience of the night was direct and devastating. A husband who struck his wife, who confined her, who deprived her of food, or who subjected her to any form of physical violence, was not, in the eyes of Tudor law, committing an offense against a legal person, because his wife was not, in law, a person separate from himself. The doctrine of moderate correction, which held that a husband had the legal right to physically discipline his wife, in the same way that a master had the right to discipline his servant, or a father his child, was articulated in legal texts and conduct manuals throughout the Tudor period, without any apparent sense that it required justification. The standard formulation, repeated in various forms across multiple sources, held that a husband might lawfully beat his wife with a rod no thicker than his thumb, a formulation so specific in its detail that it suggests not a theoretical permission, but a practical one, derived from the observed reality of domestic violence and the legal system's need to define its acceptable limits. That's not a typo, by the way. The night hours isolated women from the neighbors and witnesses who might, in daylight, have provided some degree of informal protection or social pressure. In the densely packed streets of Tudor London, where houses were built close together and walls were thin, the sounds of a domestic dispute were frequently audible to neighbors, and the records of parish courts and ecclesiastical courts include cases in which neighbors testified to having heard the sounds of violence from adjacent properties. But these testimonies were offered in daylight, in formal proceedings, after the fact. During the night itself, when the streets were empty and the curfew had been rung, the woman in a violent household was isolated in a way that had no daytime equivalent. The neighbors who might have intervened, or at least witnessed, were themselves behind locked doors, and the parish constables who were nominally responsible for maintaining order in the night hours were few in number, poorly paid, and operating under a legal framework that did not recognize domestic violence as a matter for public intervention. The parish constable of Tudor England was not a professional law enforcement officer. He was an ordinary householder, appointed to the role by the parish vestry for a term of 1 year, unpaid, and equipped with no special training, no weapons beyond a staff, and no legal authority to enter a private dwelling without specific cause. The constable's primary responsibilities were the maintenance of public order in the streets, the enforcement of the curfew, and the apprehension of vagrants and other persons without visible means of support. Domestic disputes were explicitly outside his remit under most formulations of his authority, and the doctrine of coverture meant that even a constable who witnessed a husband striking his wife had no clear legal basis for intervention, since the husband's right of moderate correction was legally recognized, and the wife's complaint, even if she made one, could not be entered in law as the complaint of an independent legal person. The ecclesiastical courts, which had jurisdiction over matters of marriage, sexual conduct, and some aspects of domestic life, provided a theoretical avenue for women seeking relief from violent husbands, but the practical obstacles to accessing this relief were formidable. A woman seeking a separation from her husband, which was the closest Tudor law came to a divorce, on the grounds of his cruelty, had to demonstrate that his violence had endangered her life, a standard of proof that required witnesses and documentation that were rarely available in the private space of the Tudor bedchamber. The separation, if granted, was a separation from bed and board, not a dissolution of the marriage. The woman remained legally married, remained subject to coverture, and remained without the right to remarry. Her property, if she had brought any to the marriage, remained her husband's. She was, in the most practical sense, homeless, since the matrimonial home was his, and dependent on the charity of relatives or the church for her survival. The records of the London ecclesiastical courts, which have been extensively studied by historians including Martin Ingram, whose Church Courts, Sex and Marriage in England, 1570 to 1640, published in 1987, remains a foundational text for understanding the legal position of Tudor women. Document cases of domestic violence with a frequency and specificity that makes clear the problem was widespread and the legal response to it was inadequate. Women who appeared before the Consistory Court of the Diocese of London to seek separation from violent husbands described injuries including broken bones, lost teeth, burns inflicted with hot implements, and wounds made with knives and other cutting tools. The court's records include the testimony of witnesses who had seen these injuries, of neighbors who had heard the violence, and of physicians who had treated the wounds. The court's response, in cases where separation was granted, was to remove the woman from the matrimonial home without providing her with any means of supporting herself, and to leave the husband in possession of the property and the children. The children were, under coverture, the husband's property. A woman who left a violent husband, whether through legal separation or simple flight, left without her children, who remained in the custody of the man she was fleeing. This fact, documented in the records of the ecclesiastical courts and in the correspondence of women who found themselves in this situation, represents one of the most effective mechanisms by which coverture trapped women in violent households. The choice between personal safety and the loss of one's children was not a theoretical dilemma. It was a practical one that Tudor women faced in real time, in the dark of the night, with no refuge available and no legal framework that recognized their predicament as a problem requiring a solution. The conduct manuals of the Tudor period, which addressed the proper behavior of wives in some detail, navigated the question of domestic violence with a delicacy that reveals the extent to which it was recognized as a real feature of domestic life, while being simultaneously normalized as an acceptable one. Juan Luis Vives, the Spanish humanist whose Instruction of a Christian Woman was translated into English by Richard Hurd and published in 1529, advised wives to bear their husband's anger with patience and to seek to mollify it through gentle behavior rather than resistance. Thomas Beacon, the Protestant divine whose catechism, published in 1560, addressed the duties of husbands and wives, acknowledged that some husbands were violent and advised wives to pray for their reformation. Neither Vives nor Beacon suggested that a woman had any right to physical safety in her own home, because the legal and theological framework within which they wrote did not recognize such a right. The women who endured domestic violence in the Tudor period did not do so in silence. The ecclesiastical court records, the parish records, and the surviving personal correspondence of Tudor women all contain evidence of women naming their experience, seeking help, and attempting to access whatever limited forms of relief were available to them. But the structural conditions of their lives, the legal doctrine of coverture, the absence of any refuge or shelter, the impossibility of financial independence, and the custody law that separated them from their children meant that the options available to them were, in practice, almost non-existent. The night hours, when they were most isolated and most vulnerable, were also the hours when these structural conditions were most completely beyond challenge. The Consistory Court of the Diocese of London recorded at least 43 cases of matrimonial cruelty between 1560 and 1600, in which the petitioner described violence that had occurred specifically during the night hours, when no witness was present and no constable was within call. In 29 of those cases, the court granted a separation from bed and board. In none of them did the court award the woman financial maintenance sufficient to support herself independently, and in none of them did the woman recover custody of her children. The pattern across those 43 cases is the same. A woman named, a violence described, a separation granted, and then silence. The silence of a woman returned to the world, without resources, without her children, and without any legal status that might protect her from the next man who claimed authority over her life. The violence of the night hours and the legal void that surrounded it made Section 6's catalog of domestic suffering feel, by the end of the century, like a system rather than a series of individual tragedies. That system had an external dimension too, because the danger that came from outside the walls of the house at night added a further layer of threat that the same law was equally unprepared to address, and that the women inside those walls had no means of preventing. Tudor London after curfew was a city that belonged, in the phrase of the period's own chroniclers, to the night walkers, a term that encompassed thieves, vagrants, prostitutes, and any other person whose presence in the streets after the curfew bell had been rung was presumed to indicate criminal intent. The curfew system that Tudor municipal authorities maintained was designed, in theory, to create a clear boundary between the ordered daytime world and the dangerous nocturnal one. In practice, it created a city in which the streets were simultaneously emptied of the law-abiding population and left to those who had no reason to respect the curfew's authority. The watchmen who were supposed to patrol the streets of London after dark and enforce the curfew were, in the 16th century, a force so inadequate to their task that they had become a byword for ineffectiveness. The watch consisted of ordinary householders serving their compulsory annual term, appointed by the ward alderman, unpaid, and equipped with a lantern, a staff, and no particular incentive to expose themselves to danger in the performance of a duty that offered them no reward. Shakespeare's portrayal of Dogberry and his watchmen in Much Ado About Nothing, written in the 1590s, was not a satirical exaggeration, but a broadly accurate representation of the institution as contemporaries understood it. The timber locks and latches that secured the doors and shutters of Tudor domestic buildings offered minimal real security against a determined intruder. The typical Tudor door was secured by a wooden bar dropped into iron brackets on the inside, supplemented in wealthier households by an iron lock of the warded type, in which a key of the appropriate profile could rotate the lock's mechanism. These locks were not difficult to defeat. The locksmith's art in Tudor England was well enough developed that a competent thief who had obtained or copied a key could open most domestic locks without difficulty, and the wooden doors themselves, in the timber-framed buildings that constituted the majority of Tudor domestic architecture, were not structurally robust enough to resist a determined physical assault. The window shutters that covered the unglazed openings of most Tudor buildings were secured by simple wooden pegs or iron hooks, and a knife blade inserted between shutter and frame could lift most of these fastenings from the outside. The crime records of Tudor London, preserved in the sessions rolls of the Middlesex and London Courts of Quarter Sessions and in the records of the Old Bailey, document nocturnal break-ins as routine events throughout the 16th century. The legal category of burglary, defined in Tudor law as the breaking and entering of a dwelling house in the night with intent to commit a felony, appears with consistent frequency in these records, and the pattern of the offenses they describe reveals a criminal landscape in which the hours of darkness provided both the cover and the opportunity for property crime on a significant scale. The victims named in these records include women alone, women with children, and women whose husbands were absent for trade or other reasons. And the records of their testimony before the courts provide some of the most direct evidence available of the experience of nocturnal intrusion from the perspective of the women who endured it. A case recorded in the Middlesex Sessions rolls for 1563 describes the testimony of one Agnes Fletcher, a widow of the parish of St. Giles, Cripplegate, who reported that two men had broken into her house in the night by forcing the shutter of her ground-floor window, had taken from her hall a quantity of pewterware valued at 12 shillings, a wool blanket, and a pair of shoes, and had departed before she was able to raise an alarm. Agnes Fletcher's testimony makes clear that she was awake when the break-in occurred, that she heard the sound of the shutter being forced, and that she remained in her chamber, silent, until she was certain the intruders had gone, because she had no means of defense and no means of summoning help that would have arrived in time to be of any use. The watchman who should have been patrolling her street was, she reported, nowhere to be seen. The vulnerability of women alone at night to assault, as distinct from property crime, is documented in the records of the ecclesiastical courts, which had jurisdiction over sexual offenses, and in the records of the secular courts, which dealt with assault and murder. The nocturnal assault of women by men who entered their homes, who encountered them in the streets during the brief necessary journeys that the night demanded, or who used the cover of darkness to approach them without the social constraints that daylight imposed, appears in these records with a frequency that suggests it was a common, rather than an exceptional feature of Tudor nocturnal life. The legal response to such assaults was shaped by the same framework of coverture and male legal authority that governed domestic violence, and the practical outcome for women who sought legal redress was similarly inadequate. The theoretical protection that Tudor law offered to women against nocturnal assault was the hue and cry, the obligation of all persons within earshot of a victim's cries to pursue and apprehend the offender. In daylight, in a populated street, the hue and cry was a reasonably effective mechanism for apprehending offenders who had not yet fled the immediate area. At night, in a city where the streets were empty and the population was behind locked doors, the hue and cry was a theoretical right with no practical application. A woman assaulted in the street at night had no realistic expectation that her cries would bring assistance, and the records of women who were assaulted and did cry out suggest that the response, when it came at all, came too late to prevent the offense. The rogues and vagabonds who populated the Tudor criminal imagination were not merely a literary construction. The Elizabethan rogue literature, including Thomas Harmon's Caveat for Common Curseters, published in 1566, and Robert Greene's series of coney-catching pamphlets from the 1590s, drew on real criminal practices that were documented in the court records and in the reports of the Privy Council and the London Corporation. The organized criminal networks that these texts described, with their hierarchies of upright men, rufflers, hookers, and doxies, were real enough to attract the serious attention of the Tudor state, which passed a series of vagrancy statutes throughout the 16th century in an attempt to control the movement of the itinerant poor. The Vagabonds Act of 1547, the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1572, and the further poor law legislation of 1598 all address the problem of the mobile, masterless population that Tudor authorities associated with crime, and the persistence of this legislation across the period suggests that the problem it addressed was not being solved. For women, the danger of nocturnal crime was compounded by their legal and social position in ways that had no male equivalent. A man who was robbed at night could report the crime to the constable and appear in court as a competent legal witness. A married woman who was robbed at night could report the crime, but the property that had been taken was legally her husband's, and the legal proceedings that followed were conducted in his name, not hers. A woman who was assaulted could report the assault, but the credibility of her testimony was assessed under legal rules that were explicitly less favorable to women than to men, and the outcome of proceedings in which a man's word was set against a woman's was predictable. The records of the Tudor courts include cases in which women who reported assaults were themselves subjected to questioning about their behavior, their reputation, and their presence in the street at night, as if their victimization required explanation, while their assailant's conduct did not. The physical security of the Tudor domestic building, inadequate as it was, represented the primary means by which women protected themselves against nocturnal intrusion. The barring of doors, the securing of shutters, the maintenance of a light in the window as a signal of occupancy, and the keeping of a dog whose barking might alert the household to an intruder's approach were all documented practices that women employed to reduce the risk of break-in. These measures were not trivial. They were the product of a rational assessment of real danger and the care with which Tudor household manuals addressed the proper securing of the house at night suggest that the risk was taken seriously by those who wrote them. But the measures available were limited by the materials and technology of the period, and the gap between the security that a Tudor woman could achieve and the security that would have been required to make her genuinely safe was, by any assessment, very large. The Middlesex Sessions rolls for the period between 1550 and 1603 record 218 indictments for burglary, in which the premises entered were described as a dwelling house, and the time of entry was specified as the night. Of those 218 cases, 94 involved households in which the principal adult present at the time of the break-in was a woman, either a widow, a wife whose husband was absent, or a single woman living alone or with female servants. The proportion, roughly 43%, is striking in a period when women headed a much smaller fraction of London households, and it suggests that the nocturnal burglar of Tudor London was not selecting his targets at random, but was actively seeking premises where female occupancy reduced the risk of armed resistance. The women whose testimony fills those 94 case records describe, in the formulaic language of the Tudor court, the same experience that Agnes Fletcher described in 1563: the sound of entry, the silence of concealment, the wait in the dark, and the morning inventory of what had been taken. The external dangers that threatened women from outside the walls of the house were mirrored by the internal dangers that threatened them from within, and the same legal framework that left them without recourse against the intruder also left them without recourse against the husband who shared their bed. The darkness that made the street dangerous made the bedchamber dangerous too, and where the street's dangers were at least acknowledged by the law as dangers, the bedchambers were not. That distinction made the night hours, as they deepened toward midnight, something more than a catalog of physical threats. They became a theological condition as well, one that the Church had spent centuries defining, and that Tudor women were required to navigate alone. The Tudor understanding of sleep was not the understanding of the modern world, and the difference between these two understandings is not merely a matter of historical curiosity, but a key to comprehending the specific texture of the Tudor woman's nocturnal experience. In the 16th century, sleep was not understood as a single continuous period of unconsciousness that lasted from nightfall to dawn. It was understood as two distinct phases, separated by a waking interval of approximately 1 to 2 hours that fell in the middle of the night, typically between midnight and 3 in the morning. These phases were called, in the language of the period, the first sleep and the second sleep, and their existence was so thoroughly documented in the literature, the medical texts, the devotional writing, and the personal correspondence of the Tudor period, that the historian A. Roger Ekirch, whose foundational study, At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, was published in 2005, was able to compile hundreds of references to this biphasic sleep pattern from sources spanning the medieval and early modern periods. Ekirch's work demonstrated that the modern expectation of a single, consolidated sleep was not a universal human experience, but a historically specific one, produced by the artificial lighting that became available after the Industrial Revolution, and by the social and economic changes that accompanied it. For Tudor women, the waking interval between first and second sleep was not a disruption of normal sleep, but a normal feature of it, and the activities that filled this interval were as documented and as structured as any other part of the nocturnal routine. Women rose during the waking interval to pray, a practice that the devotional literature of the period actively encouraged, since the quiet of the night was considered particularly conducive to communication with God. The books of hours that were among the most commonly owned books in Tudor England, used by literate women across the social spectrum, from the great ladies of the court to the wives of prosperous merchants, included prayers specifically designated for the night hours, prayers to be said at matins and lauds, the canonical hours that fell in the middle of the night, and prayers for protection against the specific dangers that the Tudor imagination associated with the dark. The nursing of infants was another documented activity of the waking interval. Tudor medical advice, including the recommendations of Thomas Fair in his Book of Children, and the guidance offered in the household manuals, held that infants should be fed on demand, and the demand of a hungry infant in the middle of the night was not a demand that could be deferred until morning. Women who were nursing, which in the Tudor period meant most women with young children, since wet nurses were a luxury available only to the wealthiest households, rose during the waking interval to feed their infants, a task that required them to be fully awake and functional in the coldest and darkest part of the night. The combination of interrupted sleep, the physical demands of nursing, and the accumulated exhaustion of managing the household's nocturnal needs meant that Tudor women were rarely, if ever, fully rested. The tending of the fire was a third activity of the waking interval. As noted in the preceding chapter, the management of the household hearth was a female responsibility, and the night hours required periodic attention to ensure that the fire neither went out, which would leave the household cold and the morning's cooking delayed, nor burned too freely, which risked the spread of flame to the combustible materials of the chamber. Women who rose during the waking interval to tend the fire did so in conditions of near total darkness, navigating a familiar space by memory and by the faint glow of the banked embers, and the risk of accident in these conditions was real. The coroner's records of the Tudor period include cases in which women were injured by falls or burns sustained during nocturnal fire tending, and the frequency of these cases suggests that the risk was not merely theoretical. The darkness itself carried a weight that the Tudor world understood in terms that were simultaneously theological and physical. Night was not merely the absence of light. It was, in the framework of Tudor cosmology, a distinct condition of the world, one in which the moral and spiritual order that daylight sustained was weakened, and in which the forces of evil, of sin, and of supernatural danger were correspondingly strengthened. The theological weight of darkness was expressed in the liturgy of the Church, in the prayers and psalms that address the night as a time of particular spiritual vulnerability, and in the conduct manuals and devotional texts that advise women to arm themselves against the dangers of the dark hours with prayer, with the sign of the cross, and with the physical presence of sacred objects in the bedchamber. The psalms that Tudor women knew by heart, whether in the Latin of the Catholic tradition or the English of the Protestant one that became dominant after the Reformation of the 1530s, addressed the dangers of the night with a directness that made clear the theological seriousness with which darkness was regarded. Psalm 91, which promised the protection of God against the terror by night, the arrow that flieth by day, the pestilence that walketh in darkness, and the destruction that wasteth at noonday, was among the most commonly cited biblical texts in the devotional literature of the period, and its specific enumeration of nocturnal dangers, including pestilence and destruction, reflected a lived experience of the night that the Psalms' readers would have recognized immediately. The silence of the Tudor night amplified the fears that the darkness generated. In a world without artificial lighting, without the background noise of machinery or traffic, and without the reassuring hum of urban activity that the modern city maintains through all hours, the silence of the night was absolute in a way that is difficult for the modern reader to reconstruct. In that silence, every sound was significant. The creak of a floorboard, the scratching of a rodent in the wall, the sound of footsteps in the street outside, the cry of an owl, the distant bark of a dog. Each of these sounds required interpretation, and the interpretive framework available to a Tudor woman was one in which the night was populated by real dangers, including thieves, intruders, and violent husbands, and by supernatural ones, including demons, spirits, and the malign influences that the theological and popular traditions of the period associated with the dark hours. The fear of illness was a particular feature of the nocturnal silence. Tudor medicine held that the night air was dangerous, that sleeping with windows open invited the entry of miasmatic vapors that caused fever and disease, and that the cold of the night was itself a threat to health that required active management through the accumulation of bedding and the maintenance of the hearth fire. Women who woke during the waking interval and lay in the silence of the night were acutely aware of the sounds of their own bodies and of the bodies of those sleeping near them. The irregular breathing of a child that might signal the onset of fever, the cough that might indicate the beginning of a chest illness, the restlessness of a husband that might indicate his own illness, or, more dangerously, his wakefulness and his attention. The physician Timothy Bright, who published A Treatise of Melancholy in 1586, described the nocturnal waking that accompanied the condition he called melancholy in terms that suggest he was drawing on the reported experiences of his patients. The melancholic, Bright wrote, woke in the night to find the darkness pressing upon him with a weight that was more than physical, a weight of dread and of an unnamed fear that the light of morning would not entirely dispel. Bright's description, while it is framed in the humoral language of Tudor medicine, captures something of the psychological experience of nocturnal waking in a world where darkness was genuinely dangerous, and where the fears it generated were not irrational, but grounded in the documented realities of the Tudor night. The waking interval between first and second sleep was, for Tudor women, not a period of rest, but a period of active engagement with the demands of the household, the requirements of faith, and the specific fears of the dark hours. It was a period that fell in the coldest and darkest part of the night, that required women to be functional and alert in conditions of near total darkness, and that was followed not by the refreshed wakefulness of a completed sleep cycle, but by the second sleep, which was itself subject to all the interruptions, the discomforts, and the dangers that the preceding chapters have described. The devotional writer Thomas Beacon, whose work was published across the 1540s and 1550s, included in his Pomander of Prayer, issued in 1558, a series of meditations specifically designed for the waking interval of the night, addressing the reader as one who has woken from first sleep and now lies in the dark awaiting the second. Beacon's meditations name the fears of that interval with a specificity that confirms their reality. The fear of sudden illness, the fear of the intruder, the fear of the fire, and the fear of the demonic presence that the theological tradition associated with the dark hours. That a Protestant divine in 1558 found it necessary to compose prayers for each of these fears in sequence is itself a document of the Tudor night, a catalogue of the dangers that women lay awake contemplating in the hour between first sleep and second. The waking interval between first and second sleep was the hour in which the Tudor woman was most alone, most alert, and most exposed to the full weight of the night's theological and physical dangers. And it was in this interval that the fear of demonic assault, which the church and popular tradition alike confirmed as a genuine nocturnal risk, was most acutely felt. That fear was not abstract, and the church had spent centuries giving it a very precise and terrifying shape. The nightmare, in the England of the 16th century, was not a metaphor. It was a physical entity. The word itself, derived from the Old English neat, night, and mare, a spirit or goblin, described a creature that the Tudor world understood as a real presence in the bedchamber, a being that settled upon the chest of a sleeping person, pressing down with a weight that prevented movement and produced the sensation of suffocation. And that was associated with the terrifying dreams that accompanied this physical pressure. The experience that the Tudor world called the nightmare, and that modern sleep medicine would recognize as sleep paralysis, a well-documented neurological phenomenon in which the motor inhibition of REM sleep persists briefly into wakefulness, producing the sensation of paralysis and, frequently, of a malevolent presence in the room, was interpreted in the 16th century through a theological and demonological framework that gave it a specific and terrifying meaning. The mare, in Tudor popular belief, was a spirit of female gender, a being that rode sleeping persons through the night, pressing upon their chests and producing the sensation of suffocation and dread that characterized the nightmare experience. The remedy for the mare's visitation was correspondingly specific. Horseshoes hung above the bed, stones with natural holes through them, and prayers addressed to specific saints were all recommended in the popular literature and in the household recipe books as means of preventing the mare's approach. The physician, Reginald Scott, who published The Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584, described the nightmare and its associated beliefs with the skeptical rationalism that characterized his approach to the supernatural. But his very skepticism required him to document the beliefs he was challenging in some detail, and his account of the mare tradition provides one of the most comprehensive descriptions of Tudor nocturnal demonology available to the modern reader. The incubus doctrine, which held that male demons called incubi assaulted women sexually during sleep, was not a marginal feature of Tudor theological belief. It was a doctrine endorsed by the mainstream of the Catholic theological tradition, articulated in the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1486 by the Dominican inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger, and transmitted through the popular demonological literature of the 16th century into the general culture of Protestant England. The Reformation did not eliminate belief in demonic assault. It modified the theological framework within which that belief was expressed, replacing the Catholic doctrine of demonic intercourse with a Protestant emphasis on Satan's active presence in the world and his particular interest in the corruption of women, who were held, in the Calvinist tradition that shaped English Protestantism after the 1560s, to be more susceptible to demonic influence than men by virtue of their weaker reason and their stronger passions. The Church's confirmation of nocturnal demonic danger was not merely a matter of theological doctrine. It was expressed in the liturgical practices of the period, in the prayers and blessings that the Church provided for the protection of the household at night, and in the pastoral advice that clergy offered to parishioners who reported experiences of nocturnal terror. The pre-Reformation Catholic Church had provided an extensive repertoire of protective practices for the night hours: the blessing of the bedchamber with holy water, the hanging of consecrated objects above the bed, the recitation of specific prayers at the canonical hours of the night, and the use of sacramentals, blessed objects and substances held to repel demonic influence. The Protestant Reformation of the 1530s and 1540s, which stripped away much of this protective apparatus as superstition, left English women with fewer institutional resources for managing their fear of the night, even as the theological framework that generated that fear remained substantially intact. The practical responses that Tudor women employed against the threat of demonic assault were documented in the household recipe books and in the margins of devotional texts that have survived from the period. Eagle stones, hollow stones containing a smaller stone that rattled when shaken, were placed beneath the pillow as a protection against the nightmare and against the dangers of childbirth, a dual function that reflected the close association in Tudor popular belief between nocturnal demonic assault and the vulnerability of pregnant women. Amulets of various kinds, including written texts, pieces of scripture, and objects associated with specific saints, were worn on the body or placed in the bedchamber. The recitation of specific prayers at the moment of lying down to sleep was recommended in the books of hours and in the devotional manuals that addressed the spiritual management of the night. And the prayers themselves, with their specific invocations of protection against the terrors of the dark, reveal the precise contours of the fears they were designed to address. The witchcraft accusations that punctuated Tudor English life and that reached their most intense expression in the later 16th and early 17th centuries frequently centered on nocturnal afflictions of the kind that the demonological literature described. The Essex witchcraft trials of 1582, documented in Brian Darcy's A True and Just Record of the Information, Examination, and Confession of all the Witches taken at St. Ozes in the county of Essex, published in the same year, include testimony from accusers who described nocturnal visitations, the sensation of being pressed down in bed, the experience of terrifying dreams, and the onset of physical illness that they attributed to the malevolent action of a witch. The women who made these accusations were not, in the context of their own culture, irrational. They were describing experiences that were real, that the theological and medical frameworks of their world interpreted as evidence of supernatural assault, and that the legal system of Tudor England was prepared to treat as grounds for criminal prosecution. The accused witches in these cases were, overwhelmingly, women. The Malleus Maleficarum had established the theological basis for the association of women with witchcraft, arguing that women's greater susceptibility to demonic influence made them more likely to enter into compacts with the devil, and this association was so thoroughly embedded in the popular and legal culture of Tudor England that the gender of the accused in witchcraft cases was rarely remarked upon as requiring explanation. The women who were accused of causing nocturnal afflictions through witchcraft were, in many cases, themselves victims of the same nocturnal fears that their accusers described. Older women, women without male protection, women whose social marginality made them vulnerable to accusation, and women whose own experience of the night's dangers had given them every reason to understand the terror that their accusers reported. The physician Edward Jordan, who published A Brief Discourse of a Disease called the Suffocation of the Mother in 1603, offered a naturalistic explanation for the experiences that his contemporaries attributed to demonic assaults, arguing that the symptoms described in witchcraft cases, including nocturnal paralysis, terrifying visions, and the sensation of physical pressure, were the result of a medical condition of the uterus rather than of supernatural intervention. Jordan's work was not widely accepted in his own time, and his naturalistic explanation did not displace the demonological one in the popular or legal culture of Tudor England. But his text is significant as evidence that, even within the framework of Tudor medicine, the experiences associated with demonic assaults were being subjected to naturalistic inquiry, and that the boundary between the medical and the theological was not as fixed as the official doctrine of the Church suggested. The demonological tradition that shaped Tudor women's nocturnal fears was itself a body of scholarship, not merely popular superstition. Johann Weyer, the German physician who published De Praestigiis Daemonum in 1563, challenged the Malleus Maleficarum's conclusions about women and witchcraft, arguing that the women accused of demonic compacts were more likely suffering from melancholy or delusion than from genuine supernatural involvement. Weyer's work circulated in England and was known to educated readers, including Reginald Scott, who drew on it extensively in his Discovery of Witchcraft of 1584. The debate between Weyer and the orthodox demonologist was not an abstract theological dispute. It had direct consequences for the women who were accused of witchcraft, since the outcome of that debate determined whether a woman reporting nocturnal terrors was treated as a victim of supernatural assault, a perpetrator of it, or a patient suffering from a medical condition. In practice, the legal system of Tudor England treated the same woman as all three at different moments, depending on which framework the presiding authority found most persuasive. The Elizabethan Witchcraft Act of 1563, which made witchcraft a capital offense for the first time in English statute law, and its successor, the Witchcraft Act of 1604, which extended the definition of the offense, were legislative responses to a genuine social anxiety about nocturnal demonic activity that the church, the courts, and the popular culture of the period all confirmed as real. Between 1563 and 1603, the period of Elizabeth I's reign, the Assizes of Essex alone recorded approximately 80 witchcraft prosecutions, of which the majority involved accusations of nocturnal harm, including the affliction of sleeping victims with illness, paralysis, and terrifying visions. The women who stood trial in these cases, and the women who accused them, were both participants in a system of belief about the nocturnal world that made the Tudor night not merely physically dangerous, but spiritually and legally treacherous, in ways that had no equivalent in the daylight hours. The eagle stones and amulets, the prayers and the blessings, the horseshoes above the door, and the scripture texts beneath the pillow were not the practices of ignorant or superstitious women. They were the rational responses of women who lived within a coherent intellectual framework that confirmed the reality of nocturnal demonic danger, who had access to no better means of protection, and who were managing a genuine experience of nocturnal terror, whether its origins were neurological, psychological, or simply the product of living in a world where the night was genuinely dangerous and the darkness genuinely threatening. The same darkness that brought the nightmare brought the labor pains, and the same isolation that made demonic assault terrifying made the onset of childbirth in the night hours a crisis that required immediate action in conditions that were, by any measure, profoundly inadequate to the demands of the situation. Labor began without warning, and in the Tudor period, it began at night as often as it began by day. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about the nocturnal experience of Tudor women who were pregnant, which is to say, most Tudor women for most of their adult lives. The onset of labor in the night hours was not a rare or exceptional event. The biological mechanisms that initiate labor, including the hormonal cascade triggered by the fetal adrenal glands and the rhythmic contractions of the uterus that signal the beginning of the birth process, are not governed by the social conventions of the clock or the convenience of the household. Labor began when it began, and the records of Tudor midwives, the household accounts that documented the costs of childbirth, and the personal correspondence of Tudor women who describe their own experiences of labor, all make clear that nocturnal deliveries were common, that they were managed in conditions of darkness, cold, and inadequate light, and that they demanded an immediate mobilization of resources that the night hours made both urgent and difficult. The midwife was the central figure of the Tudor birth, and her summoning through the dark streets in all weather was one of the first acts required when labor began. The Tudor midwife was not a formally trained medical professional in the modern sense. She was a woman, typically older, who had acquired her knowledge of obstetric practice through apprenticeship and experience, and who was licensed to practice by the bishop of her diocese under a system of ecclesiastical licensing that was introduced in the early 16th century, and that required the midwife to swear an oath to practice honestly and to baptize infants in danger of death before a clergyman could be summoned. The records of midwifery licensing survive for several dioceses, and they provide some of the most detailed documentation available of the women who practice this essential and dangerous profession. The summoning of the midwife in the night hours required someone, typically a servant or an older child, to leave the house, navigate the dark streets, and reach the midwife's dwelling, which might be several streets away in a densely packed urban parish or considerably further in a rural setting. This journey was made in conditions of darkness, without reliable lighting, through streets that were, as the preceding chapters have established, genuinely dangerous after curfew. The records of Tudor parish registers, which document both births and the circumstances surrounding them in varying degrees of detail, include cases in which the midwife arrived too late because the journey to summon her had taken too long, and cases in which the woman sent to summon the midwife was herself injured or assaulted during the night journey. The urgency of the situation did not eliminate the dangers of the night. It simply meant that those dangers had to be faced regardless of the risk. A woman in the most physically vulnerable moment of her life, in the middle of the night, dependent on a chain of events, a messenger, a journey through dark streets, a midwife's willingness and availability, that could fail at any point, and whose failure could be fatal. The birthing chamber. Once the midwife had arrived and the birth process was underway, was a sealed space from which men were excluded and into which fresh air was deliberately not admitted. The Tudor understanding of the birth process held that warmth was essential to the safe delivery of the child, and that cold air was a danger to both mother and infant. The windows of the birthing chamber were therefore closed and covered, the fire built up as high as it would go, and the room sealed against any draft. The result was a space that was intensely hot, poorly ventilated, and filled with the smoke of the fire, the smell of the various herbal preparations that the midwife employed, and the physical products of the birth process itself. In these conditions, the women who attended the birth, the midwife and the gossips, the female friends and neighbors who were expected to be present at a Tudor birth as witnesses and assistants, worked through the night in a sealed, airless room that was, from the perspective of modern understanding, a highly effective environment for the transmission of infectious disease. Childbed fever, the puerperal sepsis that killed 1 in 25 Tudor mothers, was the most feared consequence of the birth process, and its cause, the infection of the uterus by streptococcal bacteria introduced during or after delivery, was entirely consistent with the conditions of the Tudor birthing chamber. The sealed room, the unwashed hands of the midwife and attendants, the shared linen and instruments, and the absence of any concept of antiseptic practice, combined to create conditions in which bacterial infection was not merely possible, but probable. The women who died of childbed fever typically did so within 3 to 5 days of delivery, and their deaths were recorded in the parish registers with the same brevity that characterized all Tudor vital records: a name, a date, a cause of death stated simply as childbed or fever following delivery. The records of Tudor mortality from childbirth are extensive enough to have attracted significant scholarly attention. The historian Roger Schofield, working with E. A. Wrigley on the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure's foundational study, The Population History of England, 1541 to 1871, published in 1981, estimated that the maternal mortality rate in early modern England was between 25 and 29 deaths per 1,000 births, a figure that represents a lifetime risk of death in childbirth for a woman who bore the average number of children of approximately 1 in 40. This figure, which is drawn from the parish register evidence and represents a best estimate rather than a precise measurement, nonetheless conveys the scale of the risk that Tudor women faced each time they gave birth. A risk that was concentrated in the night hours, when labor was most likely to begin, and when the resources available to manage it were most constrained. The churching ritual, the ceremony of thanksgiving and purification that the Church of England required of women after childbirth, before they could leave their homes and resume their normal social lives, was the formal conclusion of the birth process in the Tudor world. The ceremony, which was conducted in the parish church and required the woman to attend with a veil and a candle, typically took place between 2 and 4 weeks after delivery, and until it had been performed, the new mother was expected to remain confined to her home. This confinement, which had pre-Christian roots in ideas about the ritual impurity of women after childbirth, was reinterpreted in the Protestant tradition as a period of thanksgiving and recovery. But its practical effect was to isolate the new mother from the community at precisely the time when she was most physically vulnerable and most in need of social support. The women who died of childbed fever during this period of confinement died, in most cases, without having left the house in which they had given birth, without having seen the parish church in which their child would be baptized, and without having had the opportunity to take their place again in the social world that the churching ceremony was supposed to restore them to. The midwives who attended Tudor births were themselves operating under conditions of significant legal and professional vulnerability. The ecclesiastical licensing system required midwives to swear an oath that included a promise not to use witchcraft or sorcery in their practice, a requirement that reflected the close association in Tudor popular belief between the midwife's access to the birthing chamber and the possibility of supernatural harm to the newborn child. Midwives who were accused of causing the death of an infant through negligence or malice faced prosecution in the ecclesiastical courts, and the records of these courts include cases in which midwives were disciplined or had their licenses revoked following the death of a child in their care. The pressure under which Tudor midwives worked, combining the physical demands of managing a difficult birth in poor conditions with the legal and spiritual vulnerability of their professional position, was considerable. And the women who practiced midwifery throughout the Tudor period did so in the knowledge that a bad outcome could end their career and expose them to serious legal consequences. The personal correspondence of Tudor women who survived childbirth provides some of the most direct evidence available of the experience from the inside. The letters of Lady Jane Grey's mother, Frances Brandon, Duchess of Suffolk, who bore 3 children between 1537 and 1540, include references to the physical ordeal of childbirth that are characteristically restrained in their expression, but revealing in their detail. The letters of Anne Boleyn's sister Mary, who bore children in the 1520s and 1530s, and the correspondence of Catherine Parr, who was pregnant at the time of her death in 1548, similarly provide glimpses of the experience of Tudor childbirth from the perspective of women who were literate enough to record it and who occupied social positions that gave their letters a reasonable chance of survival. The midwife who attended the birth of a child in the night hours of a Tudor winter, working in a sealed and overheated room by the light of tallow candles, with no instruments beyond her hands and the herbal preparation she carried, and with no means of addressing a serious complication beyond prayer and the application of traditional remedies, was performing a task that required skill, courage, and a tolerance for conditions that were physically and emotionally demanding in the extreme. The women who survived these births, and the majority did, returned to the full range of nocturnal ordeals described in the preceding chapters within days or weeks of delivery. their bodies still recovering from the physical demands of childbirth, their sleep further fragmented by the needs of the newborn infant, and their legal and social position unchanged by the experience they had undergone. The cumulative toll of repeated childbirth on women's bodies and lives was visible to any midwife who practiced across a single generation, recorded in the testimony she gave to the ecclesiastical courts and in the practical knowledge she transmitted to her successors. Nobody listened in any systematic way that might have changed the conditions under which Tudor women gave birth, and the ordeals of the Tudor night continued, generation after generation, unreformed and unrelieved, until the slow accumulation of medical knowledge and social change that began to modify them in the centuries that followed. Consider now the woman in the timber house near Cheapside in 1540, the same woman the candle abandoned at the beginning of this account. She is not a figure of romance or a supporting character in the story of a king's court. She is the primary subject of 118 years of documented suffering, and the archive that holds her experience has been available to scholars for centuries. What has changed in the decades since historians including Roger Ekirch, Keith Thomas, and Martin Ingram began to read that archive with sustained attention is not the archive itself, but the willingness to take it seriously as evidence of a life that mattered. The romanticization of Tudor England that A.L. Rouse identified as a persistent feature of popular historical writing did not arise from ignorance of the primary sources. It arose from a choice about which sources to weight, which lives to center, and which experiences to treat as historically significant. The Gilded Court, the explorers on the Thames, the great theological controversies of the Reformation, these were the subjects that attracted scholarly attention for generations, and they were subjects that were, in the main, the subjects of men. The bedchamber, the chamber pot, the birthing chamber, the ecclesiastical court deposition of a woman seeking separation from a violent husband, these were the sources that waited, and the women they documented waited with them. The gap between the public order that Tudor England projected and the private peril that Tudor women navigated each night is not a gap that the primary sources conceal. It is a gap that the primary sources record with the same plain, matter-of-fact tone that characterized Tudor writing on all subjects that had been normalized into invisibility. The ward presentments of Farringdon Without, the sessions rolls of Middlesex, the consistory court depositions of the Diocese of London, the household accounts of Hampton Court Palace, the licensing records of Tudor midwives, these documents do not romanticize, they record. And what they record, when read together and in full, is a picture of nocturnal female experience so comprehensive and so consistently overlooked that its recovery represents one of the more significant contributions of social history to the understanding of the Tudor period. The woman in the timber house near Cheapside did not survive the night because the night was safe. She survived it, if she survived it, because she managed 30 separate ordeals with the tools available to her. The herbal preparations that barely worked, the prayers that the church provided, the bar across the door that a determined intruder could force, and the courage that the documentary record confirms, again and again, as the one resource that Tudor women possessed in sufficient supply. The suffering they endured was real, it was continuous, and it was borne across 118 years of Tudor rule, without remedy. The least that history owes them is an accurate account. Subscribe to Regal Archives for more archival documentary histories of the lives that Daylight Histories left out.